Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Buchanan, and the focus is Don't Blame Me. The year is 1861, it's March 4th, Inauguration Day, and Buchanan welcomes his successor, Abraham Lincoln, to the White House. He turns to him and says, "My dear sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed." It was indeed a bit of relief for James Buchanan for his term as president to come to an end after a really difficult interregnum in which 7 states had seceded from the Union. Buchanan joined Lincoln for that traditional carriage ride from the White House to the Capitol, at which point Lincoln took his oath of office as the 16th President of the United States, and James Buchanan took his leave of Washington, D.C. Political life, his political career was over. It was back to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His home of Wheatland, where he had Miss Hetty as housekeeper. He had Harriet Lane, his niece, and he had a lot of friends that actually welcomed him home, but that welcoming changed in tone just about a month later, because it was in mid-April, just about a month into Abraham Lincoln's tenure as president, that the South fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and the Civil War began. Buchanan had some sympathies for the South, certainly during his presidency, but that came to an end once the fighting actually began and the South initiated it. At this point, Buchanan claimed that the Confederate States have deliberately commenced the Civil War, and God knows where it may end. They were repeatedly warned by my administration that an assault on Fort Sumter would be civil war, and they would be responsible for the consequences. A lot of people thought James Buchanan was responsible for those consequences, and he started to get criticized really heavily in the press. And he frankly wasn't really going to take this. He was not going to take it lying down because he didn't think he had done anything wrong. He followed the law. He followed the Constitution. In one case, he responded to these letters and these articles with a lengthy defense in the National Intelligencer, in which he said in part that, after a careful retrospect, I can solemnly declare before God and my country that I cannot reproach myself with any act of commission or omission since the existing trouble commenced. Not my fault, don't blame me. Well, this comment did not go over well, and after this, he kind of decided to keep his thoughts to himself. In fact, some of his friends were worried about his safety. Some of the local Masons, he had joined the Masons many years before, they agreed to actually stand watch at Wheatland just to make sure in case somebody tried to take things into their own hands. Well, he stayed quiet, but Buchanan never conceded fault, frankly, for anything. In fact, it was just the opposite. He started writing, and he wrote a book, this book, Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion, a legalistic document that really cast blame on everybody else but himself. In fact, it was so legalistic, he wrote about himself in the third person, referring to himself as Mr. Buchanan throughout the book. In this, he did lay blame. He started with the Northern abolitionists, and he created an interesting analogy in the book about how the North was invading on the states' rights prerogatives of the South per his strict constructionist view of the Constitution. In this analogy, according to Buchanan, with like reason might the state of Maine, whilst the delusion of the Maine liquor law prevailed, have made war on her sister states to enforce its observance upon their people, because drunkenness is a grievous sin in this belief of all Christians. In justification of this, she might have alleged that the intemperance tolerated among her neighbors and not her own spirit to intermeddle with their concerns was the cause of the war, just as it has been asserted that slavery in the southern states as the cause of the late war. Interesting analogy. Temperance, slavery, his point was states' rights, and he laid blame certainly on those Northern abolitionists. But he didn't stop there. Plenty of blame for the United States Congress. According to Buchanan, they were the only ones with the authority to do anything once the secession started to occur, but they did nothing. According to Buchanan, it neither presented the olive branch nor the sword, talking about Congress. All history proves that inaction in such an emergency is the worst possible policy and can never stay the tide of revolution. On the contrary, it affords the strongest encouragement to rebellion. Inaction, operative word that a lot of people placed on James Buchanan for his inaction, but no, in his mind, it was only Congress that had the authority to act. Their failure was a cause of the war. In the end, Buchanan concluded that separation may actually have been the better outcome than going to war. This was similar to a thought that his predecessor Franklin Pierce expressed as well. According to Buchanan, when the fraternal spirit shall give way to cold indifference, or collision of interests shall fester into hatred, the bands of political association will not long hold together, parties no longer attracted by the magnetism of conciliated interests and kindly sympathies. And far better will it be for the people of the disunited states to part in friendship from each other than to be held together by constraint. Of course, he took no steps during his time while secession was occurring to pursue this, to allow the separation to occur peacefully. He was paralyzed by his legal analysis and his constitutional strictures that prevented him, frankly, from taking any action one way or another. This was more of a retrospective opinion because the book came out in 1865 after the war had concluded, and the book was universally panned. He was criticized not only for his overly legalistic perspective, but for casting blame on everyone except two things: himself and the Constitution. They were the two innocent actors involved in this entire affair. Culpability was everywhere else to go around. This was unconvincing to his contemporaries and certainly unconvincing to posterity. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was assassinated just after the war, the surrender of Appomattox, a little over a month into his second term in office. James Buchanan shared the nation's grief over the fall of his successor. He didn't know Lincoln well. He liked him. He wrote at the time. He cared for him personally. And in fact, he got in his carriage and rode by himself out to the train station in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to pay his respects as Lincoln's funeral train made that slow trek from Washington, D.C. back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, for his burial. It was a quiet final 3 years for Buchanan himself. He was mostly at home at Wheatland with his family. Harriet Lane, his niece, did eventually get married. Henry Johnston became her husband, and Buchanan had the opportunity to see one of her two children after being born. Not technically his grandchild, but he had raised Lane very much as his own since her teenage years. His own end came on June 1st, 1868, when Buchanan died at the age of 76. He went to his grave firmly believing in the merits of his actions. As he said the day before he died to his friend Hiram, swore that I have always felt and still feel that I discharged every public duty imposed on me conscientiously. I have no regret for any public act of my life, and history will vindicate my memory. In this last area, he could not have been more wrong. Could not have been more wrong, as history has painted James Buchanan simply as the worst president in American history. Someone who was paralyzed with inaction at the most perilous time in the country's history. He read the Constitution. He determined he was powerless. He showed himself as a legalist, not as a leader that the country needed. But was he the worst president ever? Let's take a look. Foreign policy, not much here. There wasn't much foreign policy under the James Buchanan administration. Domestic, well, the economy was pretty bad. Panic of 1857 on his watch, and he believed, strict constructionist again, that it was not the role of the federal government to help out the citizenry during difficult economic times. He believed in reform, not relief. This was not helpful, and the economy was sour his entire presidency. The other big domestic issues, of course, bleeding Kansas. He did nothing to solve this, despite a lot of attempts to support the Lecompton Constitution to bring Kansas in as a slave state. This was rejected by Congress, and eventually it went nowhere, despite a lot of efforts on his part. This was clearly a failure. And then there was the Dred Scott decision from the Supreme Court just a couple of days after Buchanan took his oath of office, something that he strongly supported. And in fact, some have conjectured that he had worked behind the scenes to encourage a couple of the justices to vote in favor of this Dred Scott decision that essentially ruled that Dred Scott, a slave, could not sue in federal court because he wasn't a person. He was property in the eyes of the law and the Constitution, one of the most infamous decisions in Supreme Court history that Buchanan, whether he had a role behind the scenes or not, we don't really know that, but we do know he supported it. He thought this was going to put an end to the strife between North and South, very naively thinking that. And he said, look, the court made a decision. We must support it because that's what the Constitution says. He's been reviled for that in his support of this particularly odious decision. Not a good record, certainly, for James Buchanan. Not a lot of good things to point to. But again, was he the worst president in the American history? For that really goes to the fact that people have blamed him for his performance in the interregnum, blamed him for failing to stem the tide towards civil war. And the question is, could he have done something? Could he have actually done anything to prevent civil war? And this is hard to make that case. The South did not secede over anything James Buchanan had done. The South seceded because a Republican was elected to be President of the United States. And the South had generally concluded that the Republican Party, whether it was Abraham Lincoln or it could have been William Seward, it could have been John Fremont, it could have been anybody from the Republican Party who was committed to the ideology and the political perspective, no more expansion of slavery beyond the states in which it already existed. They didn't believe in popular sovereignty. They didn't believe in slavery expansion. And with a Republican in the White House, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, that said to the South, we are no longer going to stay part of this union. We are going to separate. That was not because whatever James Buchanan did or didn't do. He did not cause the Civil War, and frankly, there was almost nothing, likely nothing, that he could have done to prevent it. Think of his options. He really had three. He could have called out the military, like Lincoln eventually did after the South had attacked Fort Sumter, and tried to suppress this rebellion before it got out of hand. Now, that eventually would have just brought on war sooner. And besides the fact he didn't have much of a military. The U.S. military, the standing army, was only about 16,000 soldiers. About a quarter of that, or 20% or so, were Southerners that were all leaving to go back to their home parts of the country and be part of the secession. Most of the rest of the army was on the frontiers in the West, so he didn't have much in the way of an army. He certainly could have called for volunteers. He could have tried to send in reinforcements to Fort Sumter. The likelihood that just would have brought on war sooner. What about recognizing the South and just letting them go? That would have, I guess, solved the problem of not having a war. He alluded in his memoirs that might have been a better answer. He didn't take any action to pursue that, to sort of recognize the South and let them go peacefully. That could have been an option, and it would not have preserved the country, although potentially could have avoided war. Or he could have done what he did, the best he could, buy some time, keep war from starting, which did not start on his watch, and hand the keys over to his successor, Abraham Lincoln, who had been elected by the people to take the country to this next stage. In any of those options, is there anything that Buchanan could have done that could have both preserved the Union and prevented civil war? Most likely not. There's then the issue of, well, what did cause the Civil War? And of course, there's been lots of discussion about this. Was it states' rights infringement? Was it slavery? And of course, both of those are so tightly intertwined. It was both. It was states' rights and it was slavery that were amongst the major activities that led the South to eventually secede. But what about the role of the Constitution? Where does that sit in this entire equation? James Buchanan, like all presidents, take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It's not to preserve, protect, and defend the Union or the United States or frankly anything else. It's preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And he was a literalist when it came to the Constitution. He read that document, he knew it well, and he saw nothing in it that he could do to prevent the activities that eventually led to the Civil War after secession had occurred. The Constitution was basically silent for such a perilous kind of scenario. It offered no real help to somebody like James Buchanan, who wasn't going to take on any authority beyond which that document, to which he had taken an oath to preserve, protect, and defend, gave him the authority to do. It wasn't there, and he wasn't going to assume authority that wasn't available to him per his oath. So that's one perspective. The other part of the Constitution also goes to, again, what were these other factors that led eventually to this national fracture? As we talked about, you could look to the election of a Republican, in this case, Abraham Lincoln being a key catalytic moment, or the things before that, Buchanan's inaction, the Dred Scott decision, Kansas-Nebraska Act, fugitive slave law, the Mexican Cession, the Missouri Compromise. All of these were elements on that path to national fracture. But the original seeds on that path to fracture were in the Constitution itself. From the initial compromises that the framers were willing to make to have a country. Because if they didn't make compromises over slavery in 1787, when the Constitution was originally put together and signed and ratified, there probably would not have been a full United States as it was founded, because the South at the time was not going to concede its rights, its view to slavery, and the North at the time, the founders were willing to concede this compromise scenario in order to have a country. Well, that proved ultimately unsustainable. As Abraham Lincoln would say, a nation that is half slave and half free cannot stand, and in essence, he eventually was proven right. Grand compromises were tried in 1820, in 1850, other moves to try to avoid this eventual break, and none of those were going to be successful, because that original sin, that slavery was baked into the founding of the country, in the Constitution itself, was that initial crack on the path to national fracture, that a whole bunch of efforts over the next 70 years tried to resolve. They were unsuccessful, and there was nothing James Buchanan was going to do in his final 3 months in office that was going to prevent the eventual fracture that occurred. Some perspective on the blame that goes all around in terms of what ended up being secession, civil war, and the role, or not, of James Buchanan. That is James Buchanan, and don't blame me, from the life of James Buchanan. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.